Welcome to T-Smack, home of the T-Smack. May I take your order?
Welcome back, everyone, to another episode of Talking Smack, where we talk superheroes, movies, animation, and comics. I am your host, Josh Scar. I am returned from the bar fight that Alex and Justin let you all know that I was involved in. There was a small plot continuity error there. Um, there aren't that many Packer bars in the state of Illinois, so I was not beat up by a Packer fan. Just to make that clear, because Packer fans don't beat up on each other unless it's on Twitter. So just getting that out of the way. But I am joined this week by Matt. Matt, how you doing?
I'm doing good. How are you? Aside from, recovering from your injuries.
I'm doing pretty well. This last month has been a bit of a hassle for me, but I am back. I am returned. Uh, I mean, I got 2 weeks off after we did 100 episodes, so
Hey,
I can't complain too much.
sometimes the world makes you take a break.
Yeah, I'm not going to complain too much because it was a needed 2-week break, among other reasons, because I was able to catch up on Strange New Worlds. So now I am fully
Yeah.
up to date on 3 episodes in.
Finally, watch Star Trek. You watched Star Trek.
Why don't you count Lower Decks? Lower Decks is included in all of the
I do
Star Trek
count I do count
nonsense.
Star Trek, our Lower Decks. I just want you to watch more of it. There's a whole breadth. Just imagine if you watched more Star Trek, just imagine how much richer Lower Decks would be for you. I've said this on mic
That's
before. I don't recall if it's when you've been on or not, but I'm glad you like it. But there are like episodes or like gags that I think of where I'm like, what must that seem like to someone who has not seen like the very specific episode of Star Trek that joke is referencing?
my great aunt had a wonderful saying, which was, "You can't miss what you don't know."
That's
So
true. That's
in
true.
this case, if it's a reference to something, it just goes right over my head, and I don't know. So ignorance is bliss in that situation.
But I mean, you know that there's something you don't know, right?
It depends on the situation.
If it
Like
has the
there's that.
cadence of a joke, but it's like like when Blake Blorp did the Flickamly Do or whatever, you're like, okay, I don't know what's going on here.
Honestly, with Lower Decks, the only thing that I am like not 100% certain on if it's actually a Star Trek thing or if they just introduced it for Lower Decks is the Packlids. They just feel like this really weird segment of a joke that feels like it belongs in an animated series, but I could also see it being from a 1960s serialized sci-fi show where there's this advanced race of stupid people.
I mean, do you want to know?
I would love to know
Those dummies are from Next Generation.
that.
One day
Great.
I will get you to watch at least some of that golden era of Star Trek. Maybe I'll make you like a homework list.
Would you say the Paramount era is like a renaissance? I don't mean to say renaissance. It's just something stupid stuck in my head from How I Met Your Mother.
I would say it has its moments. It has its ups and downs. Like I'm someone who has appreciated all that stuff. I don't think it has all been stellar. So I don't know if I would say it's a renaissance, except insofar as like Star Trek was not on TV for like a decade, and then now it is very much on TV constantly. Which is not to say it's not
Uh,
quite good. I think most of it is quite good, but you know, there's something about that old '90s stuff.
oh yeah, yeah. I know what you're saying, because like we just recently reviewed Indiana Jones and the Dial of Destiny, and one of my biggest complaints with like the Disney era Star Wars movies, I will specifically say movies, with the exception of Rogue One, there's something to like the digital format that just kind of takes away from these kind of shows, which is weird considering they're sci-fi and they're supposed to
Sure.
be like futuristic technology, even though Star Wars is set in the past. And like Indiana Jones, the film grain just adds something to the aesthetic of the movie that you don't get with digital, with the crisp
Yeah,
4K image.
yeah, I can vibe with
Something
that.
just doesn't sit right with me, at least.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, it's
but
settled.
speaking of
I'm gonna make you a list of all the old Star Trek you have to watch, and you
just
have to
all
watch
of
it.
it, maybe I'll make my way slowly through everything. We'll see. But before we get into this week's topic, we are going to hear from our friend Dan over at Casting Views. So Matt and I will be right back to talk about some comic book goodness, or maybe badness. We'll see.
Fancy taking a humorous trip down a random topic each week? You do? Well, you're in luck. Casting Views, presented by me, Dan, and a host of guests, bring you just that. With topics from the world of entertainment, science, sport, and everyday life, there's bound to be a topic that's going to inform and amuse. Catch Casting Views every Sunday on all listening platforms now.
And we're back. So this week, Matt and I are doing something a little different. We've been trying to figure out a way to get more comic book talk into the podcast because we love comics. That was a big part of what got us into doing this podcast, and a big part of like why Matt and I continue to be friends, even though I
Yeah.
have wrong opinions on everything, is that uh, comics are just fun nonsense, and it's a great escapist mechanism as well, and great storytelling mechanism. And we just want to talk more about comics, and we have a pretty good and rare 4th of July lull in movie reviews. So we're going to dive into some comics. Matt, if you want to give a little bit more backstory as to what we're talking about and why maybe we're talking about it.
Yeah, this week we are talking about the 2011 DC crossover slash miniseries Flashpoint, which one of the reason why we're doing this. It's been what 12 years since it came out. There's a
Almost as long
couple,
as the Flash movie has been in development.
yeah, almost, yeah. There's a couple of reasons. Like we went back and forth and like, okay, we want to do some. The original idea was let's do some fun comics, just like a short run, like a mini series or a 6-issue story or something. And we batted back and forth. Some of the options were, and we landed on Flashpoint for like a big reason. At the time we were talking about this, the Flash movie had not come out yet, had not totally apparently bombed yet. At that time, talking about Flashpoint felt like it would be a lot more relevant. And I guess it still is because the movie is still in theaters, because the Flash movie takes quite a bit of inspiration from it. And I'll do a quick, I'm not going to get into nitty gritty, but I'll do a quick synopsis here, basically. 5-issue miniseries written by Jeff Johns, illustrated by Andy Kubert. Goes from May to October of 2011. The basic gist of the story is Barry Allen, who is the Flash. He wakes up one day. The DC universe is a very different place than where he left it. He doesn't have powers anymore. His his mother who was murdered when he was a kid, is still alive. There's basically none of the superheroes who are in the DC universe are around, or they are not the people that he recognizes them. Like the world is on the verge of like war with Atlantis and Themyscira, or like inching closer to war, like led by Aquaman and Wonder Woman,
Yeah, there's
respectively.
there's like a cold war that's happening, and it's just inching closer to just going
Yeah,
full-fledged war.
yeah,
The Themyscira, the Amazons have taken over England as their new Themyscira. Something has happened to Themyscira. I think it's implied that, or maybe they say outright, I can't remember, Atlantis flooded
right,
Themyscira,
right.
among other things, like one of the Flash's biggest rogues. Captain Cold is apparently a hero, and he has replaced the Flash as the hero of Central City. Is that
Central City.
his? So
Yeah.
I don't know why I always confuse Central City and Fawcett City.
Yeah, and among other things, like there's no Superman, and notably, when Superman's rocket came to Earth, instead of landing in Kansas, it crash landed in Metropolis and basically decimated the city. So like thousands of people died. So Barry Allen assumes that his nemesis, the Reverse Flash, is responsible for this. So he's like, I'm gonna go seek out Batman. Batman can help me. Turns out, it's not Bruce Wayne, it's Thomas Wayne, Bruce Wayne's famously murdered father, who is more akin to like a Punisher than Batman. So the two are like, we're gonna Barry convinces Thomas to help him. Like, if I can restore my powers, I can fix all this so this world never happened. Your son's alive. Oh yeah, also Bruce is the one who died in the alley, not Thomas and Martha. So the two attempt to restore Barry's powers and recruit allies so that they can like get this done before the world breaks out into war, which is like understood to be, if this happens, it's done. It's like an extinction level event if these two finally go at it. Long story short, the big climax of the thing is Barry discovering that it wasn't Reverse Flash. It was actually him going back in time to reverse his mother's death, or prevent his mother's death, that caused this huge shattering event that changed the entire timeline. And Barry has regained his powers at this point, so eventually he is able to go back and set things right. He fixes the timeline, but it is also different. It is a reset timeline because the big thing that the story does is usher in what is known as the New 52. It is a hard reset on the DC continuity that had been in place since 1986 since the original Crisis on Infinite Earths. So from this point on, every single DC book relaunches with the new number 1, 52 of them. That's why it's called the New 52. Every book relaunches. All the characters are younger. Much of the history has been stripped away, although some of the stories are still, the death of Superman still happened, like Batman Year One still happened, all that kind of stuff.
Yeah, basically they condensed most of the major events down into a 5-year period,
Yeah.
and it got muddied really quickly because Batman was in the middle of a really good run at that time. I think it was being written by Grant Morrison.
Yep. Yeah.
And he had a run of like 2 or 3 years leading up to this, and there were just a bunch of stories. Like they still had is it Nightfall is the one where Bane breaks his back. So like
Yes.
there's a whole bunch of things that like every Robin has existed, and Tim Drake is now Red Robin. It's a big mess of things, especially in the Batman universe.
Yeah, it's a very messy. It is a clean reboot that is also very messy, because like one of the things they obviously wanted to do is make sure that you would still have a reason to buy and read every big best-selling trade paperback that ever happened. So like Death of Superman still happened, like you said, Nightfall. Jeff Johns himself is in the middle of a big Green Lantern run at the time. That's one of the things that is sort of adopted into the new universe, because Jeff Johns at this time, especially at DC, he is like the guy. He's like the guy who is like dictating the direction of the universe. So, he's in the middle of his Green Lantern run. Obviously, he's going to incorporate it into when he continues it in the New 52. And Flashpoint itself, beyond this, has like become the Flash story, where obviously the movie is based on it, starring Public Menace, Ezra Miller. There was an animated adaptation of it. The CW Flash show did a few episode arc that was a version of this basic story. And, this is like Jeff Johns at the pinnacle of his powers. This is like him. He had, at the conclusion of like a return to the Flash. He had been on the book from like 2000, 2005. Then he left, comes back with this big, huge thing, brings Barry Allen back, culminates in Flashpoint.
I was just about to ask, actually. You would know better than this, and maybe John would know. Wally West had been the Flash for 30 years.
Yeah, since 1986, because Barry Allen dies in Crisis on Infinite Earths.
And Wally West took over as the Flash, and then was it 2008, 2007, somewhere in there they brought Barry back? It was around Blackest Night, wasn't it?
I think it was sometime. Well, it's weird because of the nature of the Flash, because he's a time traveling character. He can, every once in a while, there would be a thing where like Barry from the past meets up with Wally in some way. So I think a version of Barry Allen might have come back in Blackest Night. I don't remember the exact timing on that. I believe the Flash Rebirth, which is the miniseries where Jeff Johns is like, he's back for real and he's the Flash again, starts in 2009. So just a couple years before Flashpoint.
Yeah, quick Google search. Barry Allen was resurrected in Final Crisis #2, published in August 2008.
That's right. Yeah, which is also another Grant Morrison comic. And then,
Which I do have that trade, but that's one of those weird events that DC was doing where they published like 2 issues a month for a year or something like that. Like it's a huge event.
yeah, and not to tip my hand too much, but unlike this one, that book rules. um,
I wasn't implying anything like that,
yeah,
but
yeah,
yeah.
yeah, yeah, yeah. But anyway, it is a very important comic. The New 52 reboot like reverberates in DC Comics for years. They have never technically like officially fully undone it, even though like they've basically walked it all back at this point in fits and starts. So, the idea was for us to do a fun, good comic. And I think we ended up doing an important comic more than good because this sucks shit. Maybe that could be our jumping off point to the actual discussion, but this is a fucking terrible comic.
And you have a bigger understanding and appreciation for a lot of these characters than I do. You've been reading comics significantly longer than I have, especially more in depth. My initial thoughts are, yeah, this isn't great, especially with it being used to serve as like a jumping off point for a mainline reboot. My main issues are the art is very hit and miss. I don't mind Andy Kubert. I think he's kind of a poor man's Mark Bagley. Like you can see some similarities in their art and some of like the more like warm facial shots where like someone's smiling and just having a heartfelt moment. But his action beats and certain angles that he has, it's like a real gross combination of John Romita Jr. and Mark Bagley that just does not work. Like there's
Sure.
a big splash page on like page 4 or 5 of the trade paperback where everyone's proportions are off, everyone's face is hideous. Wonder Woman has like a 2-inch waist. It's just there's a whole mess of things going on that just does not look great. And getting into the story, I'm going to draw some comparisons here to the animated feature. I haven't seen the live action movie just because I don't think it looks good. I have no interest in seeing it, but I have seen the animated movie a couple of times. One, the art gets worse in the movie, and two, they pad out a lot of stuff in the movie. Like the movie opens with like a 5 or 10 minute mini Justice League story where the Flash and the Justice League come together to fight like all of the Flash's rogues to kind of establish like, hey, this is what the world was.
Right.
And now Barry's going to go change everything, even though he's going to think it's Reverse Flash, Eobard Thawne. Where I think with the comic, at least, I like the mystery of just here's the Flash. He's a great hero. Here he is sleeping at his desk. And then all of a sudden, like we're in a different world. We're
Right.
thrown into it with Barry. And we're like, what the hell is happening? What's going on? I like that mechanic a lot, but then it goes downhill real quick into like, oh, some pretty bad edge lord stuff.
Yeah, and like they sort of account for this, but I'll crib a joke from a much bigger podcast that I listen to called War Rocket Ajax. I'm probably cited them before, but they're a comics podcast. They're great. You should listen to them. But whenever they talk about this comic, one of the things they mention is like, why does Barry Allen's mother being alive mean
Superman's
Superman?
trajectory.
Yeah, Superman's trajectory changed, or somebody else dies in Crime Alley, right? Like they sort of like
I can understand that. I can understand the Crime Alley stuff. Like it's the butterfly effect. They're playing with that
Sure.
concept. But yeah, I don't understand how Barry Allen's mom changes the trajectory of Clark's space carriage. I don't understand how that impacts.
Yeah. And I mean, what they
that.
try to do, they try to paper over that at the end where like, for whatever reason, Barry Allen going back in time and doing this shatters time. So you can kind of infer that like, it's not her being alive. It is whatever he did fucked everything up. But it's still very silly that like this woman is like load bearing for the DC universe, which is especially funny because like Flash comes back in, we just mentioned 2009, Barry Allen comes back. that is when Jeff Johns himself introduces the idea of he's got this tragic backstory where his mother was killed. That's Jeff Johns. I don't know if it's him getting high in his own supply or what, but he's like, this thing I introduced not 2 years ago is the most important thing in the world in some ways. And like fundamentally, my biggest issue with this comic is, and it's a crossover event. This is something that is not this kind of thing happens with all big crossover events because that's one of the reasons they do them. But this book feels so much less like a comic book story and something that wants to funnel you into buying all of the various crossovers that explore the world, of a world that, as you suggest, is not very interesting to begin with because it's just everyone's mad or upset or like shittier versions of themselves. But
you have a Batman who's okay with using guns and says swears. Like, who doesn't want that?
yeah, go buy the 3-issue miniseries or whatever it is about him, and oh, surprise, Martha Wayne is the Joker. That's a real thing that happens in these comics. But like that was the main thing.
And she still has her own version of Harley Quinn.
Yeah, that's the biggest thing is, I knew this. I admit I went into this with some preconceptions because I've been reading comics for a long time. In 2011 through, the 2010s, if you're familiar with DC, it's impossible not to feel the reverberations of this book and like kind of know what it's about, especially since, like we've said, it's so adapted after that. But reading it now for the first time, I was surprised at like how much it just kind of lands with a thud. Like you mentioned the thing where it starts out with, it's kind of a mystery story. Barry Allen wakes up and he doesn't know what's going on. The thing where he comes up with a theory that, oh, it must be Reverse Thawne, like removing all of my allies from the timeline to destroy me, and the reveal that no, it was actually my fault. Both of those feel tossed off as an afterthought. Like they're in issue 4 or 5, whichever one it is. They're in the middle of the war. It's happening, and Reverse Flash is there, like, oh, by the way, it was you. It was you that did it. Anyway,
he shows up. He shows up and he's like, somehow you freed me from the timeline, despite the fact that no, he was running through time and when Barry was going back through time.
Yeah, I guess.
And
yeah,
it's a big mess of nonsense. Basically, if I'm remembering correctly, Thawne is traveling through time through the Speed Force when Barry changes the past, which
right, and
then
that protects him. Yeah,
that creates like a little cocoon around him, a time cocoon where even though technically he shouldn't exist in the future anymore because Barry doesn't exist or the Flash doesn't exist, so he has no one to like fanboy over and become an evil version of, because he was in the Speed Force traveling through time, that doesn't happen to him. He doesn't just like cease to exist for whatever reason. Obviously they just wanted the Reverse Flash to have a part in the story in the finale, but it makes no damn sense and it's dumb. The explanation is extraordinarily stupid.
it's so weird because like the Reverse Flash for most of this book, like you are supposed to understand that the reason this is happening is because of him, but he's an afterthought. He shows up to explain A, why he's alive, and B, why that it's Barry's fault. And like that's it. He's not a factor in the story, even though arguably it seems like he should be, right? But the book
Yeah,
is
they foreshadow it. There's a moment where Barry finds his ring, or he has his ring that contains his suit in there, and the suit that is contained within the ring is actually the Reverse Flash suit.
yeah.
So you're thinking like, okay, and it's just a big red herring or yellow herring in this situation.
It's a book where just things happen. Like the thing I always think about, I think it's the end of number 2, where like Barry has gotten Thomas Wayne on board, and he's like, we're gonna do this. We need to recreate my powers. So I need these chemicals. I need to get struck by lightning. And the big twist at the end of the issue is what happens to Barry Allen when he gets struck by lightning? The same thing that happens to everything else. Ha ha ha. The final page of that issue is Barry Allen has been turned into charred hamburger by the lightning strike. Wow. Oh, big twist. The next issue immediately opens with, oh, by the way, I'm alive, and we have to try again, and oh, this time it works. Within 5 pages, it's like, yeah, don't worry about that. Like, I'm alive and everything's fine. And also, the second time we do it, lightning doesn't strike twice, but maybe if we try 3 times, it'll work. Why do it in the first place?
One thing, and for listeners who are completely lost, I apologize. We're going to be jumping around a lot because this is very much a and then this happens and then this happens and what if this happened kind of story, because it's an Elseworld story essentially. So they basically just went, what if Wonder Woman is evil and she kills Steve Trevor?
Yeah.
What if Lois Lane is a guerrilla reporter and reporting in a war zone, but also she's a government informant, so she's gonna have to have her life threatened? And what if this and what if that? And it's a whole mess of just and then it's not, and then because this happens, then this causes this to happen. It's more just we're showing you the ripples that we think are cool.
Yeah, and so much of it, like I said, is feels intended to say, oh, what's Lois Lane up to? She gets 2 pages in this book, and if you want to find out more, go read the miniseries about her. But like, she's not a character that has any bearing on the story we're telling. And she meets up with another team of characters that are like, ooh, DC Universe but twisted, and those characters show up very briefly in the finale, but it's a thing where it's like it smacks so much of Lois Lane, The Outsiders, whatever they called it, on sale now. Go read that. Which, like I said, is a thing that happens with these big crossovers, but this one more than most that I've read feels so much more artificial in terms of like you say, things just happen, and like half the time the things that are happening are just there, and in my reading feels like are there to get you to read a different comic book more than they are like trying to find interesting ways to hook you into those comics. It's just, oh, by the way, here's the 3-page ad for that.
Yeah. And one of the big plot lines in this story, besides focusing just on Flash, because we have this even dark and grimmer Batman, his plot line is essentially Cyborg's trying to recruit him into the US government's Task Force X, and they need him to be their tactician, because they're going to go into New Themyscira and try and prevent the war from happening somehow. And none of the like Z level heroes and villains that they bring into Cyborg's team are interested unless Batman wants to join. This is their way of being like, look at how cool this Batman is. No one will do anything without him.
Yeah, and it gives you the stakes where like, okay, this guy has to be involved for some reason because Jeff Johns decided this was a very cool version of Batman.
I mean, granted, in the Flash movie, if they had gotten Jeffrey Dean Morgan back as Thomas Wayne to be this version of Batman, I might have been I may have actually been inclined to see it somehow. The Michael Keaton hook, I don't really care about. Like, I love Michael Keaton. He's the first Batman I ever knew, but I'm also more interested in something new than I am interested in nostalgia bait.
Yeah, for sure. And to keep on that tangent a bit, a related tangent, it's one of those movies that like I'm sure I will watch when it hits the artist formerly known as HBO Max at some point. But like between its star being a very, like I said, a very public menace, and also just like seeing the way they like pilfered various people's graves to get some of those cameos, I was like, you know
Yeah.
what? I don't if nothing else, I don't need to pay money to see this in the theater. If it happens to appear on a service I already pay for, yeah, maybe. But
Mhm. Yeah, I've heard it's fun. It's a poor man's Spider-Man No Way Home, but like I have no interest in that. I've already seen a good Spider-Man No Way Home, so I'll just watch that again if I have to.
if nothing else, it seems like a pretty faithful recreation of its source material because it seems like it sucks shit, and so does this comic.
Yeah, yeah. So let's talk a little bit about Superman here in Flashpoint. So we talked about how space cradle landed in Metropolis, created a giant crater in the middle of the city, and he's being kept under lock and key in a red sun cell, which, like, how the hell did they figure that part out?
Got to buy the miniseries. Got to buy the Superman miniseries that was related to it.
Because yeah, he does just kind of fuck off for 2/3 of the book once they find him, and he shows back up at the end for no real reason other than they needed a Superman to show up.
Yeah. Well, and it's just, I think there is like a, I don't know that we need, it's a very poor jumping off point for a reboot. I think it's not the best Flash story you can do, but I feel like there's a core of a decent story in here, because like I'm a sucker for these kinds of dark alternate present stories, like, Back to the Future
Yeah.
2 style, whatever. But because it's so overloaded with other bullshit, it never is able to be the story it thinks it is, right? Like one of like the what is meant to be like the emotional climax of the story is Barry finally, realizing what he's done inadvertently, but having his powers back and being able to go back and fix it. He stops and talks. He has one more conversation with his mom, which should be a big deal. This is him choosing to give up this thing he's always wanted in order to save the world, basically. But it is just nothing, right? It's a nothing scene, partially because this character, Barry's mom, showed up for like a panel, a
Mm-hmm.
page in the first issue. There's no hook there. It's not, because Barry's been too busy getting struck by lightning and finding out about the bullshit politics of this bullshit world and healing immediately from his lightning strike when he gets his powers the third time. It's just, it's
Yeah,
just,
it's not like it's not like Peter Parker going back and having one more conversation with Uncle Ben, or in certain continuities, it's not like Clark going back and having a conversation with Pa Kent, depending
yeah,
on whatever continuity you're going with. So Barry going back, is it Nora is his mom's name?
yeah, yeah,
Going back and having a conversation with Nora, it it means very little in the context of the grand scheme of the Flash, Barry Allen as a character. In the story, it's a nice moment, as you say, but we need more moments, and they try to like get a little bit of a heartstring moment with it too, but it also undercuts the value of these like 3 pages of Barry having one last conversation with his mom, which at the end of the comic, when he's reset the universe and everything's mostly back to normal, he's like, "Oh, I still remember the old I remember the other universe. I remember everything. I remember every birthday I've ever had with my mom and whatever." It's weird. And that's one thing we forgot to mention too, is that the part of the ticking clock for this is that
right.
Barry is like forgetting his memories.
Yeah, like the new timeline is like cementing. Yeah, yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so Barry's losing his memories of the original timeline that he's from, and he needs to get there before he forgets everything.
Yeah,
And
it's
that's
like the
part of
dual.
Thomas.
Yeah, I'm sorry, the dual clock of that, and like when the war starts, it's
Yes.
over for humanity. So yeah,
Yeah. And Thomas Wayne's big motivation is get back to my son, get back to the universe where my son is alive, because I don't want to be alive anymore. I'm basically on a suicide mission to to just be Batman that runs around with a gun.
yeah,
But
he's like the
I
one character in this entire book that is like, this universe is sucks shit. you know, it's awful. It's almost like admirable. Like it is. There's a way you can do that that feels interesting. Where like metatextually, he's the character who knows he's in a shit comic book, but it's also he's the character who's in the shit comic book universe that also wants you to buy 30 other comics about the history and characters of this universe.
I got to go back to the movie here for a minute.
Yeah.
Not the live action one, the animated one.
Oh, sure.
Again, I think they do little improvements on the story. They get rid of a lot of the Z list characters that show up in this, like Elemental Woman, and I couldn't even tell you who anyone else in Cyborg's little Task Force X
You got to read the
is. Like
miniseries. You got to
there
read the miniseries.
there's the Shazam family, which are Batman's agents. but Cyborg has his own little troop, and I don't know who the hell any of them are. But in the movie, we don't get any of that. It's mostly just Cyborg, who is played by Michael B. Jordan, and I think he probably gives like the only good performance in the entire feature. The voice acting and all that, even from Kevin Conroy, rest in peace, is like really stilted. But the movie does one thing really well that I think the comic really missed the mark on, which they're like, once Barry gets his powers back, he is waiting for his power to reach like maximum force again.
Right.
He's
Yeah.
trying, he's waiting for it to build up. And that's part of the ticking clock as well, is that Barry's just not up to full speed yet.
Yeah.
Whereas in the movie they fixed that, where it's still stupid, but it makes more sense. There's only like so much speed force anyone can use at a given time, and whenever Eobard Thawne, the Reverse Flash, is around, he's like siphoning off parts of the the speed force, so Barry can't like go faster than the speed of sound. He can only go so
Sure.
fast, like just below the speed of sound, or he can't go so fast that he breaks the time space continuum. So in the movie, Thawne is like constantly siphoning the speed force. So like he's never really seen until the final battle when he's supposed to show up like in the comic. But Barry can never get to full speed to fix anything because Thawne is creating an additional roadblock to him
Right.
hitting his powers. Where in this, eventually Batman just goes, "This guy sucks. I'm gonna stab him through the heart. Barry, run."
Yeah.
And there's no like build up to it. It's just like, oh hey, Thawne's dead now. Barry, you can go and save the world and in your way.
Yeah, things just happen. Like you mentioned the Shazam family, which is a thing I actually forgot about until you mentioned it. But there is a scene where they're all just like, "Oh, we're sitting around hanging out. We're all a bunch of teenagers." And then Batman and the Flash just like show up. There's like no sense that like, oh, we got to get to the Shazam family. There's like nothing establishing it. It's just like, oh, they're here now because the story needs them to be here now, and they need them to be on the team now. It's just like,
And this is where we reveal that they're Batman's agents.
I almost have no words. It's so bafflingly constructed. And it's so weird because like I don't know, this is like Jeff Johns at the height of his powers, right? Like he has basically created the modern interpretation of Green Lantern at this point. Like if you are familiar with the Green Lantern concept, odds are it's the version that he established in a few years before this. He brought Barry Allen back. This is like the third of multiple big crossovers he has written for DC. He's had big runs on like the Justice Society. He's had Superman, Green Lantern is ongoing at this point, that are generally considered pretty decent. So like I don't know if this is a thing where like DC editorial is like breathing down his neck, but this is like the moment where he would most be able to like have some sway, I would think, in like how he's writing this comic. So like I think this is just what he wanted it to be for the most part, and that is fucking baffling to me.
Yeah, I am curious how much of this is like, where can we create an offshoot for this little mini series of Lois Lane and the Outlaws? Where can we create an offshoot for Superman learning about Earth after having been in prison for 30 years? Where can we find out about Thomas Wayne's past and all this stuff? Like I the publishing process of that is really interesting to me,
Yeah,
because what how do you publish this story as is and not go like, is it too bloated? Nah.
yeah, right. And I don't recall, because sometimes when they do a big thing like this, they will like cease publishing everything else and replace it with like the Superman book is ended, but the Superman miniseries is taking its place in the schedule. You know what I mean? DC is
Yeah,
doing it right now actually with their Night Terrors event, which also seems like it's going to be bad, but we'll see. Where everything is basically stopped for 2 months while this big event plays out.
that's not related to Dark Knights of Steel, is it?
I don't believe so. I think it's just everyone falls asleep and has bad dreams. What's their worst nightmare?
Flashpoint
Um,
again.
yeah, but it's I don't recall if the other books were still happening at this point, or not, and I did not look that up, unfortunately. I can only imagine what it must have been like reading all this stuff if like the books you actually wanted to be reading were suspended in favor of it. Like it's just incredible. Like I again, I'm almost struggling to find the words at like how insane this is to me. And I do wonder like how much, Jeff Johns comes back in to the Flash in 2009, wraps this up by the end of 2011. I am wondering how much of this is him coming in and saying, I'm coming back to the Flash and I've got an idea for a reboot, and or how much of it is like DC being like, we're going to reboot, we're looking for ideas in how to make that happen, or somewhere in the middle, like whose idea is this ultimately to like do this story, and why is it the way that it is, aka really terrible. It's just, and compare this, there were crises in between Infinite Crisis or Crisis on Infinite Earths and this, but this is like Crisis on Infinite Earths in 1986 is like the best comparison point, because that's the first time that DC does an event that is like fully hard stop. After this, we are resetting the universe, and like I don't think that is necessarily a good story, but it feels grander and it feels important and it feels like, they the tagline was "Worlds live, worlds die, things will never be the same," and that felt true, right?
Mhm.
But this is just this. You get none of that from this. None of that is in this. It just feels totally limp and totally like nothing.
Yeah, I mean I've already said everything I have to say critically about this. I don't have a lot of praise to throw around for this. Like I said, the art is really hit and miss. Like I just pulled up a page here where it looks like Barry's leg is up on his shoulder, even though he's supposed to be like lunging forward and it's just his leg kicked behind him. But it
Yeah.
looks like he's like holding his leg as a club. Like the perspective on a lot of this, and just
I think
it's
Kubert is a really good artist and he's got a very stylized look, but there are definitely times where that can be really weird. And I do kind of wonder if this was a case of like this book has a hard deadline because we are also figuring out an entirely new slate of books to launch. So it's coming out by October 2011 no matter what. So
yeah.
maybe he is
Because yeah,
rushing it a little bit.
I can't say that I have seen other comics where I'm like, man, this Kubert stuff is not great. But like the final few pages, I know the new 52 gets a lot of flack for almost every book looking exactly the same, and I think that does kind of happen here at the end of the book. But I think the art is really on point here. Like it looks really polished, jaw lines look good, eye lines look good. It all just looks really solid and it looks consistent. Whereas if I go back 6 other pages back to Barry running backwards in time or finding his mom or something, like I said, he looks like he's carrying his leg as a club in one shot. There's this weird shot of Superman with green flares coming out behind him. Like, is it kryptonite? What the heck's happening here? There's just all sorts of weird stuff happening, and it's inconsistent until you get to those final few pages where that's probably where he spent a good chunk of his time in the last issue, was making sure that new 52 tone is set, because everyone's got their new costumes and yeah.
Like the important bits are like, okay, this is like the moment where we are officially transitioning into the new universe. I'm thinking of that page, and maybe this is the same page you're talking about. I don't see it in front of me, where like it's Barry running across the spread, and you see like you kind of see the old versions, you kind of see some of the new versions. There's that mystery woman who has the fucking gall to say, actually, this is the DC universe being finally right for the first time.
Yeah, no, that's a few pages later, but I know the splash page you're talking about, where they have different versions of like the Dark Justice League and then the regular Justice League, and then there's like a little bit of the new 52 Justice League hidden in there, and or not so hidden in there, and it just like that splash page is nice, but yeah, who the hell is this lady? Like, is she the Speed Force embodiment? Like, what the hell is happening?
If I'm remembering correctly, that lady is Pandora, who appears, and like that was one of the big mysteries of the New 52. Like, this lady maybe has something to do with the change in the universe, and I think she appears in like the first issue of every new book in some way. And I don't know exactly what that ends up being. I think it ends up being very disappointing and terrible because, a lot of the
Because
big,
that's the New 52.
yeah, like a lot, at least at the very least, a lot of the big like editorial level decisions were awful. There are actually some pretty decent books that's been out of the New 52, but like every time that it's like, oh, we're doing a big crossover for the next few years, is like, what are we doing here?
Yeah, Flashpoint, how this became so beloved amongst a pretty good chunk of comic fans, I still don't know. And with the movie too, the animated feature, I don't understand how that movie is so beloved. Like, the art alone, the animation is hideous.
Yeah.
If you look at the like Aquaman from that movie, his neck muscles are sitting on top of his neck muscles on top of his neck. Like, he and he's got a tiny head. Like, he does it's not even like exaggerated Bruce Tim Paul Dini style art. Like, it's just gross and it looks wrong. And I don't even know. I was supposed to do a review for it for another podcast prior to the Flash movie coming out, but that fell through. So I ended up having to watch it again against my will, kind of. Um, and there are, as we mentioned, there are good bones to a decent, if not really good, story here, with Barry going back and creating a butterfly effect to save, to cause even more chaos. Like, the butterfly effect story is a tale as old as time, but if done well, it can be really impactful. But to your point, Matt, Nora Allen means absolutely nothing to most comic book readers, especially Flash fans.
Yeah, and I think the most successful adaptation of this story is the short arc they did in on the Flash show, and some of that is by virtue of the fact that even though that show is part of the Arrowverse, which is like, the small sort of connected universe with a bunch of the CWDC shows all taking place in the same world, it is still sort of like its own show where it can't just be like, oh, Superman is here and Wonder Woman's here. It has to be very focused on the characters in this show. So like that is a version of that story that is primarily about Barry going back in time to stop his mom from dying, which is also something that was baked into the show from the beginning because
Yes.
it comes after Flashpoint, and also Jeff Johns is a producer on that show. So she is more of a character, and she has more of a presence. Like, she looms more over that show than this.
Yeah, and Barry's dad being framed for the murder is a big crux of the first like
Yeah,
3 seasons of the show, or
yeah,
at least the first 2 seasons until they get to the Flashpoint. So
yeah,
like, it, as your to your point, it makes sense that the story makes more sense when we're more invested in Nora being alive or what it means to Barry. Where in this case we just run across Barry being like, "Oh, hey mom, you're alive. That's weird. What's happening?"
yeah.
And
Right.
we have this mystery to unfold, but they never really care about the mystery, because for 4 issues, until Thawne shows up at the end of issue 4 going, "I know what you did, Barry,"
Yeah,
we just think, okay, the Reverse Flash changed something and Barry's trying to fix it. And the
yeah,
ticking clock is World War, super World War, and Barry losing his memories.
yeah, and yeah, and the CW show, to its credit, and because it because by virtue of the fact of what it's doing, it has to drill down to that core, right? Where it's like, this is a story about Barry. He's got that same ticking clock, and the things he's worried about. It's all about Barry having to choose between this new world he finds himself in, which is not significantly shittier than the one he left, which I feel is important, and also, and losing his memories of his original life and being the Flash. And it is much more because it also is not so focused on being a huge crossover that has to be like, oh, what? Go read Lois Lane, go read Batman, go read Superman. It can be the story that it is. And I don't know that it's like great. It's been years and years since I've seen it. It's like season 3 of 9 seasons, which just ended a couple months ago.
Yeah, and I think it's like the first 3 episodes of that season.
Yeah, and it's relatively self-contained. But so maybe it's bad, but I think in terms of if we're grading on the curve of Flashpoint adaptations, that is the one that's most successful because it is like it is finding the Flash story at the core of Flashpoint and just doing that.
Yeah. Yep. 100% agree. And also like Grant Gustin, Melissa
Yeah, he's great.
Benoist, is it Danielle Panabaker? Like all wonderful people to look at. Can't
Right.
go against it. John Wesley Shipp,
Yeah.
like
If nothing else,
yes, please.
Say what you will about the CW, the shows they did, those specific DC shows, they're very good at casting people that, if nothing else, are very pleasant to watch do things on screen. They're very they cast pretty attractive people, and that's not nothing.
Watch Stephen Amell do some salmon ladder drills. Like, yeah, okay,
Yeah,
no problem.
Yeah, sure. The CW is built on that.
All right, Matt. Well, we've punished ourselves enough, I think, getting all this off our chest. And this is something that we're going to continue to do, whether or not the listens come in for it or
hopefully they'll be good.
Hopefully. They can't be worse than the Star Trek episode. I don't mean to dump this on you, Matt, but people did not care for the Star Trek episode.
Oh, gosh.
But we're still going to do Star Trek too, because we got to talk season 2 of Strange New Worlds since I'm caught up now.
Maybe that's the thing that'll finally kill the show.
There you go. Continuing to talk Star Trek despite us having made the joke for the last year or so. But we are going to try and like alternate. So we're going to try and do like either a Marvel or an indie comic series, 6 issue, maybe 12 issue, depending on like the significance of the story. We were talking about doing like Spider-Verse, but we were talking about how this one has like, oh, go read Lois Lane, go read Superman, go read Batman, where this Spider-Verse is just like, you got to read 30 other books to get the full story here.
I think, and it's been years and years since I've read Spider-Verse, the original story. I think that one probably holds up a lot better on its own, with maybe a couple offshoots, but I would have to test that. So maybe we won't find out unless we ever do an episode. But my memory is that it holds up. The core, like 7 issues, 8 issues, whatever it is, that holds up better than this does, which feels entirely hollow without all that shit. But I could be wrong about that. I wouldn't. I mean,
let's put it to the test. Maybe we make that our next episode of Josh and Matt's Comic Adventures.
Yeah, I mean, if we want to be timely, we now have until 2026 before the next news peg.
Maybe we'll time it with the home video release for Across the Spider-Verse. Yeah. But with that, Matt, thank you so much for taking the time to be here tonight and punishing yourself along with myself to read Flashpoint, the New 52 reboot. Thanks so much, everyone, for listening. You can follow me on Twitter at Josh_Scar. You can follow the podcast at Talking Smack Pod. We are also on the new Threads social media website, as well as Hive Media, Hive social media, post news, and Instagram. Don't forget to join our Discord. Matt, you want to tell everyone about the Discord?
Oh yeah, Discord's great. We, if you like this, if you like me just going off on rants about whatever we haven't been talking about, but you want to send in text form, that's the Discord. Maybe I got to stop saying that because I feel like we don't get a ton of new people. Maybe that's pushing people away.
Oh, we had Greg from I Have Some Notes join. That's a big get for us.
We did. Yeah, that is a big get. But point being, I could be very verbose and passionate about things I care about or don't care about. That's all over the Discord. So it's a fun time. I'm pretty much always in there because I'm not very good at my day job. So, if you come in and start chatting about something, odds are at least I will be there to at least see it.
Well, if you like this comic book discussion and you have other recommendations, please shoot them our way at tsmackpod@gmail.com. Thank you to Leo Allen for musical themes, which you are hearing right now, Beppo for our original avatars, Retro Studios for our Ricky avatar. Please like, subscribe, rate, review, and most of all, thanks again for listening. Everyone, take care.
Who loves T-Smack?
I love T-Smack. Is it true? Mm-hmm. I do, ooh.
Don't read Flashpoint.